Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jenny Liu. I am Associate Professor in Urban Studies and Planning, and together with my colleague, Dr. Chris Monsieur, we lead the Friday Transportation Seminar. So today I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. So our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held on the Portland State University's urban campus located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar is hosted online fully. So today, we are very pleased to have Cole Grisham present on transportation planning in tribal communities. He is a transportation systems planner with FHWA Western Federal Lands. His work focuses on long-range transportation planning, particularly in the areas of regional intergovernmental policy in the American Northwest. Cole is a certified planner through the American Planning Association and holds a BA in political science and MUP in regional planning from the University of Michigan. He is also one of our current students, currently pursuing a PhD in public affairs from Portland State University, focusing on regional planning and policy in tribal communities. And just right before we start our seminar, I'd like to let you know about our upcoming seminars, and you can see the next 4 that are upcoming, which will be very exciting. And well, today, as with all of our other online seminars, you can expect our speaker to speak about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. We will be receiving questions through the questions feature on your control panel, and me and my colleague will ask them at the end of the presentation, so you can leave the questions all throughout the presentation itself. If we do run out of time for your questions, we will email the questions to our speakers and see if there's an opportunity for them to respond. Closed captioning is enabled, but you have to click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. And we are recording today's webinar, so it will be available later today with the presentation slides as well. And finally, if you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Cole for our presentation today.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I will share my screen. Come on. And can you verify that you can see it? Great. So thank you for having me. My name is Cole Grisham. I'm a transportation planner at Western Federal Lands. And in addition to the background, the bio that Professor Liu provided, I'm also Assiniboine out of Fort Peck Reservation of Montana from my father's side. And so what I want to cover today is a research study called Transportation Planning in Tribal Communities that our office is managing in partnership with FHWA's Office of Tribal Transportation. I want to cover a little bit throughout this lecture on some context around tribal government and planning, because I recognize that people are coming from a wide variety of backgrounds and may not be familiar with some of that context, but really focusing in a bit more on the research process, including the objective questions, design, data collection, some of the nitty-gritty of the research, but also how tribal engagement factors into this study as a whole. I won't necessarily be covering data analysis and reporting aspects of the study at this point, because we are kind of at a hinge point in the study. We're not complete. It's still in progress. We've done a first round of data collection, but not the part that's probably most interesting and valuable to our audiences yet, which is really getting into the deep dive with tribal partners or tribal planners themselves. But at a high level, where this project came from, it was identified by the Office of Tribal Transportation through a research needs statement that transportation plans don't always have a clear value in tribal communities. How they're used, what their purpose is, and how they inform post-plan decision making is not always clear. And that's somewhat true of planning in general. It's not uncommon to hear of a long-range plan being completed, then sitting on a shelf and no one taking a look at it. I think it's a challenge we encounter in planning a lot, is communicating what the value of planning is and how it can actually be used to inform decision making afterwards. But this specific study is looking at how do we enable plans to be most valuable to tribal communities, most contextualized to what tribes are interested in, and then backing up from there, what tools do you need to be able to develop those effective plans? And so that's really what we want to cover today, or what I want to cover today. Let's see. I'll also add, by the way, that I'm presenting on my laptop in front of me. My notes are on my screen next to me. So if it looks like I'm not paying attention to my own presentation, that's not exactly the case. It's just where my notes are. But first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the rest of the project team. This is definitely a team effort between a few different groups. And Misty Klon, who's the program planning specialist for the Office of Tribal Transportation at Federal Highway Administration, is the project champion who wrote the needs statement to begin with, and has been a key component in guiding where the research is going. And along with that, we're supported by Manuel Sanchez, who's the Office of Tribal Transportation Tribal Coordinator, Stephanie Stormer, the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center, who's an environmental program specialist, Jared Kujolkowski, who's our partner with the US DOT's Volpe Center, who's doing a lot of the legwork, whose group is doing a lot of the legwork research as a whole, and is the Volpe Center's project manager. And his team includes Juan Tran, who's the community planner, Jason Sidoriak, an economist, and Holly Bostrom, policy analyst. So that rounds out the initial project team, and I'd be remiss to not give credit where credit is due. This is a truly team effort. So initial background. I want to start by giving a little bit of background, as well as the research issues that we saw. So in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes with an incredible diversity of geography, population size, and interests. The map you see on the screen here is an excerpt from a Bureau of Indian Affairs map on tribal lands. But in the lower 48 states, most tribal lands are organized as reservations or sovereign nations in a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. federal government. And for those who aren't familiar, a reservation is an area of land reserved for tribe or tribes under treaty or another agreement with the U.S. by executive order, federal statute, or another means to serve as a permanent homeland. And also where the government holds title to the land in trust on behalf of the tribe. There's approximately 56.2 million acres of land held in trust by the U.S. government for various tribes and individuals. There's approximately 326 land areas in the U.S. administered as federal Indian reservations, be it reservations, pueblos, rancherias, missions, villages, communities, and otherwise. The largest of this is the Navajo Nation, which is right in the dead middle of the screen there, which crosses a four-state region. The smallest is a 1.32 acre parcel in California. So the variety is pretty wide. Many smaller reservations are less than 1,000 acres. So the variety of tribes and lands varies considerably across the US. In Alaska, by contrast, tribal lands are organized a bit differently due to the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement Act. And these are organized by native villages, corporations, and regional nonprofits. And we could spend many more lectures discussing Alaskan tribes alone. And indeed, my own doctoral research is mostly focused on planning in Alaskan tribal communities, but I won't go too much further than that. So as part of this government-to-government relationship between the federal government and tribes is the Federal Indian Trust Responsibility, or a legal obligation on which the U.S. has charged itself with obligations of the highest responsibility and trust towards Indian tribes. That being a quote from the regulation. Over the years, the trust doctrine has been the center of numerous Supreme Court cases, thus making it one of the most important principles in federal Indian law and policy. One of those responsibilities that really focuses on this research is that of transportation. So under the 23 U.S. Code, Section 202, its Tribal Transportation Program, part of the federal government's trust responsibility, Congress makes available transportation funding annually to tribes across the country. And it's administered, this program, the TTP, is administered jointly by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Office of Tribal Transportation at Federal Highway Administration. Tribes have a choice on which agency to work with for this program. And so it'll vary throughout the country on who their primary point of contact is for tribal transportation program. And tribes receive about $505 million annually spread across the US as of 2020 in transportation funding through both agencies to plan, develop, and maintain their systems. Among these expectations for the use of the funds is that tribes should carry out a transportation planning process and fund projects in accordance with a transportation improvement program or a TIP, similar to a state DOT or an MPO. The challenge is that how a planning process applies to and benefits tribal communities is not always clear, especially thinking about a formal long-range transportation plan or LRTP. So looking at the initial proposal, one of the two themes we saw come out of it with research is that one, existing planning tools don't always align with tribal community context and needs. And two, it's not always clear what benefits planning provides transportation project selection and delivery in tribal communities. Through various feedback mechanisms, it's also been observed that existing planning tools don't, kind of skipped ahead there. But basically that's the crux. What tools, how do these tools that already exist apply? And then what does planning actually provide? So from there, we turn that into two different research questions. How do tribal LRTPs inform the decisions tribal planners and leadership make following plan development? And then two, what tools best inform plan development to tribal planners? I put best in quotes there because it's going to vary from one community to the next. I find this is also helpful to think about if you're looking at backing up why planning at all? Why focus on that? And I see planning's purpose is really to enable a community to respond to problems and opportunities in the future rather than reacting. To put it a little cavalier, I often say planning rarely actually solves anything, but it allows communities to respond to problems and opportunities going forward. It puts you in a place where that you're not reacting, you're not necessarily surprised by the challenges that come up. So this purpose, based on that, the study's purpose is to ensure tribes have the right tools to conduct effective planning, as I had noted there, respecting community context and constraints. And with that, we turn that into three goals here. First is to align planning tools to tribal needs, ensure LRTPs are implementable by tribal staff, and link the planning phase of the project delivery lifecycle to project design, construction, and maintenance. And so thinking about how we achieve these goals, one of the questions that help us, what can we walk away with? What are some end products? That's more or less where we started on our goals and thinking about what might come out of that. We'll cover a little bit more of that as we go. So based on more of that background, I want to jump into a little bit more of what the actual research process is and has been for this. And again, we're in a place where we haven't completed the research study as a whole, and that's okay. But instead, we're at quite a ways through the research to give an idea of where we've been, some of the challenges we've encountered, and where we might be going, and also allow for some good feedback from this group, as well as some of the other engagement opportunities we've been involved in, to shift and pivot where we might go moving forward. So I'm a planner, so I like to think about the process for the planning process we're looking at. And so what you see on screen here are kind of the key milestones for this project. And for anybody who's managed a research study in the past or written a term paper, this isn't that far off from what you might think about. We prefer to structure this research around key milestones, or what I like to think of as progressive deliverables. So the project isn't all or nothing. We don't wait till the very end to produce any kind of materials out of it, but instead develop it in small pieces, small bits that users can respond to and then help inform the next phase. So that begins with the literature review, doing our homework on what's out there, what's already been done, what have tribes already written about in this area, both in terms of scholarly literature as well as applied and applied literature, professional, and so on. Moving from there into the methods section of, given what we know and what we don't know, how do we intend to fill those gaps based on what tools are available to us, what resources, and then also how do we complement the resources we might be missing. And then from there into really the meat of the work, which is the data collection, implementing the methods component through data collection by learning from tribes and their partners on what works, what doesn't work, and what tools we can come out of that. And this fourth component of tools development, in my projects, I tend to think of it more as the so what aspect. So given the first three of what we've known and what we've collected, what is the added value of this research? For this specific project, we're looking more at tools development. What tools already exist that can be better contextualized to tribal interests, or what new tools may need to be developed to fill that gap, leading into more of the final report, summarizing the findings and disseminating. So taking what we've learned and what we've developed and ensuring that it's available for the communities that could use this information. So I'll go into each of these in more detail as we go through, but the point here is to break the larger effort down into digestible pieces, as I think about it. And why would you do that? I mean, the simple way is that it's easier to manage that way, to do in small portions, and it's easier to iterate. It's easy, once you have the literature review and methods, you can go back and inform the other components. But most importantly, it's more effective for stakeholder engagement. And that's the component that, while this seems linear, this is the component that really knits it all together. So like I said, while the structure is pretty linear, and most of the projects I lead are, engagement is not linear, nor should it be. We want to ensure that tribes are engaged throughout the project and at the level that they want to engage in. So the risk I often see in planning, I have seen in some planning and research components, is that research generally and planning specifically is sometimes susceptible to black box management. It's opaque. It's hard to see what's going on behind the scenes in terms of the project development and so on. And ensuring you have quality engagement throughout at the right level helps break down a little bit of that black box mentality. And what I think of those elements being is conducted by a small group of technical experts, engage only with the impacted community for data collection and disseminate findings if you're lucky. So basically the beginning and end, little validation or challenging of assumptions, and some of the other concerns. Those are the things you want to avoid in quality planning and public engagement. If these tools are meant to serve a community, it should be led by that community, and any assumptions should be validated with that community, and in this case, tribes specifically. And so in the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more about how we've approached that. So you can think of the engagement process really being these four circles together, and it's not perfect because it's not like project management team and tribal partners at the very end don't interact, but this is one helpful heuristic. So the project team is that which I covered earlier, and our role is really to manage the scope, schedule, budget, and deliverables, the nitty-gritty of the project, as well as doing the data collection itself. And that's similar to the Technical Advisory Committee. And the TAC, as it's called, really takes a phase gate approach to project steering. So the TAC is, and I'll touch on what that means here in a second, but the TAC is composed of primarily tribal planners from around the country, from Alaska to New York to Oklahoma, and a bunch of other, and a wide variety of other areas as well. Tribal planning professionals who can speak to different aspects of how planning is conducted in their community, amongst their partners, and research generally. And like I said, we think of it as a phase gate approach, as the TAC's engagement. The TAC does not meet monthly, and it doesn't meet as needed. Instead, it meets primarily around those key deliverables that I showed before to ensure that what we're producing and we're researching aligns with the original intent of the project that the TAC had agreed on to begin with, as well as ensuring that anything we're producing is actually serving the tribal planning community. And the third component is really to steer us towards the next deliverable. So thinking about literature review to methods, how does the literature review inform the methods section and fill those gaps? The TAC's role is really to guide and point us in the right direction towards that. What are the gaps that actually we do need to fill? What are those that are really red herrings and we shouldn't go down that road based on experience and practice? And how does what we're finding actually reflect the lived experience of tribal transportation practitioners? And then outside of that, those two circles to the right are tribal transportation practitioners and their transportation partners. Those are really the two big audiences for this research. Practitioners being the same as those who compose the TAC, but much more broadly. Can't feasibly have 574 tribal practitioners serving on the TAC, so we have to look for we have to find a subset who have the capacity to serve on this project and also can speak to a broad sample, and then enable our research to engage with a larger audience as well. And then transportation partners being those like my own agency, Federal Highway Administration, as well as state DOTs, MPOs, and other groups that work with tribal planners. Yeah, I think that's all we need to cover on that. So a little bit more on what we found. So looking through the literature review, some of the big components to cover are the laws and regulations. What are the basic standards for transportation planning and tribal communities in order to receive funds and some of those expectations? What's the institutional framework? And I covered that on an earlier slide too, thinking about 23 USC. It covers a lot of the basics of what's expected. And then from there, some of the program implementation aspects of what does that actually mean in practice? What are the policies that have been developed around that, or program management? I also looked at quite a bit about what tools already exist out there. One of the more unique ones that we found was a transportation planning board game for tribal planners that was developed. And apparently we have quite a few in my office, though I haven't seen them yet. And it actually helps train new planners on the planning process in tribal communities. It's meant for tribes, and I believe it was developed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but don't quote me on that. So tools like that exist, and obviously much more technical and complex ones as well. The basic planning process for that tribes tend to follow in developing the long-range transportation plan. Some of the key priorities, which center around safety, cultural heritage, public health, economic development, how those apply in tribal communities. For example, one of the things you'll find through different research institutions that also focus on tribal planning is the issue of jurisdiction for and monitoring of highways that connect to and through tribal lands. Who are the actual police or highway patrol that are monitoring those roads, and how do you deal with jurisdictional issues, and especially as it relates to very challenging problems in tribal communities, such as, say, human trafficking and things like that. That's a major safety issue related that transportation planning can help address, but that can be elevated through research like this, as well as some of the gaps and next steps. And so we took this back to basically doing this homework aspect to the TAC and said, how does this align, what we're finding, how does this align with your experience and your expectations? And some of the big things we heard right off that was narrow the scope and focus. The study cannot be all encompassing. Also stick to the tribal transportation program and the project lifecycle. The TAC really wanted us to focus on what can tribes do within and through TTP, and how does that inform their process, and focus on what planning can actually inform. So thinking about post-plan decisions. So for state or MPO planners, it's the same thing. The transportation plan can help inform project selection and funding. A refinement plan, so an LRTP might be broken down then into a safety plan or a transit plan or something like that, those refinements, as well as the big component is how can a plan best serve a tribe's ability to consult with its and be at the advocate for its interests at the table with other governments, such as the state DOT for available funding. So we're really focusing on those post-plan decisions. So our methods. We've chosen to use an interview and discussion approach using a wide variety of questions and more of structured discussions. And our format has been a mixture of both individual, small group, workshop, and conference discussions. And it depends on what kind of questions you're asking, who the audience is, how to structure that. And I can probably go into more detail if people have questions on what's the best approach for which. And also the methods of categorization of interviewees. So it's one thing to talk to a federal, an Office of Tribal Transportation Travel Coordinator on what they do. It's another thing to talk to a tribal planner on their aspect of the same program. And so being able to separate out the different groups of interviewees and understand what's their role in the process and how do they work with their different partners. Also limitations. It helps that we laid out a lot of our limitations. One is the number of discussions. We are bound by the Paperwork Reduction Act on how many interviews or discussions we're allowed to have with non-federal stakeholders. So we have to respect that well. The other one is travel restrictions. You guys may be aware that COVID puts a lot of limitations on the ability to travel. And so we have to think about how we do things virtually, who can be where, and for what purpose. And also the changes to the any changes to the planning process due to COVID. And the other component with travel restrictions, I would say, is we really value and have emphasized trying to do conversations and discussions with tribes in person. That's what one thing we're planning to do. It's one thing that TAC reinforced as well, is to do these in person. So we'll touch on it in a little bit, but obviously with the travel restrictions, that puts a little bit of a wrinkle in your plans. And so the TAC's feedback on this was really focused on your collection, on what you're going to collect, and don't promise the moon. Narrow the focus and make sure that this addresses the original challenges. And the other component is focus on existing tools to be revised, or new tools, segmenting a bit of that out. And make sure to look at the breadth of tribal practices that are out there currently, those with more developed planning processes and those with less developed. As we touched on earlier, the size alone of the land area for tribal communities is incredibly vast and diverse. And so the planning process within that should similarly diverse in its complexity. So our TAC would like to see a good representation of that. So where we're going for data collection. Looking ahead, right now we've completed our federal discussions, and we're moving into, right now we're in the midst of more of our engagement opportunities and a check-in with the TAC of what we've learned so far and how we pivot for tribal discussions going forward. Winter and spring, we're looking at we're starting our deeper tribal discussions leading to planning analysis going forward. And so one question you might come up, and I'll preempt here, is why do federal discussions before tribes? If tribes are the focus of this research in the audience, why not start there? The answer is that's what we wanted to do. So we wanted to start with tribes first and get the federal and other partners second to really emphasize that component. But in talking with the TAC about travel restrictions and COVID impacts, our TAC directed or recommended that we look at it, that we postpone tribal discussions until you can do it in person if possible, and therefore focus on the federal and partners first to establish a bit more of the footprint of the project going into that, and also allowing for more time to identify what tribes to engage with, when and where. So that also meant we extended the project out by a year. Originally, it was a 2-year project. Now it's a 3-year, because we really want to be able to do in-person tribal discussions if possible. And as we're getting closer to that, we'll see if we'll be able to do that. We'll go back to the TAC here in a week or two to talk more about how best to approach tribal discussions. But that's really why we inverted. And so the fall engagement component, I see it as a hinge point for the project and the TAC. It's where we can review what we've learned so far summarize it for the TAC, and really get TAC feedback and direction on how to then move into the tribal discussions most effectively and respectfully in this season. So this next slide is not from this study at all. It's actually from thinking about data collection. It's actually from the Native American Transportation Issues in Native American Communities for Transportation Research Board. We did a strategic planning session with them a few weeks back. But the reason I put this in here is to take a look at thinking about virtual public involvement in data collection. There are many ways to go about it, and the value, I think, can be a lot greater than people give it credit for. And what you see here is, some of you may be familiar with Jamboard. It's an online open source tool through Google, like Google Docs and things like that. But basically, it's a web-based sticky board. And we used this through a facilitated session that I facilitated to look at the transportation needs for practitioners related to research. And the question you see above is, how do you envision your transportation system in 5, 10, and 20 years? And then below that are some of the responses from the group. The reason I show this is that you don't, even in virtual public involvement, you don't have to be complex to get really valuable data and information and engage the community you'd like to serve. A sticky board in person, putting sticky notes on a wall, in many ways is planning methods 101. And there's some good reason to go back to the basics around this. And that's what we did here. And we got a tremendous amount of good information, both in terms of what's put up on the board here, as well as some of the discussion around that. You see, for example, greater emphasis on safety under the 5-year vision, having a deeper discussion in the group, like, all right, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are the challenges that are informing that? And while some of these are vague on screen, more reliable data, for example, actually in the meeting with some good facilitation, you can facilitate a good amount of discussion around those deeper dives. Now, there are some obvious drawbacks to data collection like this, or there's some drawbacks. One is that there's not much detail after the event of what happened. Some of that discussion doesn't really get captured well. It's anonymous, so you don't necessarily know who put what where, and it's only a snapshot in time. And last, I'd say it's self-selecting. These are transportation practitioners and researchers talking about their vision of it, but it doesn't necessarily capture adjacent fields such as education, which has a big role in transportation planning as well, or some of the other components. It's a smaller community. But on the plus side, it's dynamic, it's easy to use, it's easy to walk through. There's a lot of interaction for tools like this that produces a lot of good, valuable information. And just like it's a risk, it's also a positive in that it's anonymous. You can start sharing ideas without any real challenge of it coming back on you that you have to necessarily explain it. Most of the time people do, but still it allows for a little bit of freedom in that regard. And so the point is, for looking ahead to data collection, for us to be thinking about what tools do we have in our tool belt to best engage with tribes going forward. And this is one that actually has worked pretty well. Let's see. So what have we found so far? Kind of the 6 key points are: one is to focus on post-plan decision points. That's been reiterated. Clarify the LRTP and the tribal tip development and use. Understand data collection and its use in tribal communities. So for example, safety and fatal accident data is nationally is a quantitative measure that's used for safety grants. But in some tribal communities, a lot of that information is anecdotal and word of mouth or qualitative, which puts a big barrier in applying for safety grants if you don't have the quantitative information. So understanding how that information is actually collected in tribal communities, and then how does it translate to opportunities that already exist, can be a big benefit. Synthesize and apply financial planning resources. There are tons of different planning funding resources out there and grants, but ensuring that there's a central location for them, that they're easy to access and user-friendly is incredibly important. The other is synthesize and apply existing resources. So there are a lot of tools out there, but they don't always necessarily apply to tribal communities or have tribal communities in mind. I think the safety example is probably the top one for me. There's plenty of tools for safety planning, but ensuring that those translate to how tribes actually collect data, what information is available, and then what it could look like in their community is an opportunity for improvement. And also in engaging with the tribes identified in our literature review in the methods and the initial discussions and by the TAC, ensuring that we are looking ahead to it, how we're going to engage them. So I don't have too much more, but one of the things I want to cover is looking ahead to engaging with tribes. So right now we're identifying tribes to include in the tribal discussions through our TAC, literature review, our previous discussions, and suggestions from meetings like this. So as we wrap up, if you add it to the Q&A or if you email me that you would like to be involved in these types of discussions, or think of a good tribal community that would be worth engaging with, by all means, please add that. That's always beneficial. And then taking that, really talking with the TAC here in the near future, in a week or two actually, about what are the criteria by which the TAC would like us to engage tribes. We have far more tribes available to engage than we possibly could for the purpose of the study. So what would our tribal members on the TAC actually like to see? What criteria? I suspect we'll see a lot around geographic distribution, size of tribe and transportation program, their use of consultants versus doing in-house planning, leadership and staff perspectives, and the extent of planning activities. These are just some of the things that have already come up from the TAC and other resources as well. But our discussion here in the near future will help flesh out what criteria the TAC would like to use to identify tribes for discussion. So some other considerations. 3 things that I think we should keep in mind here for this is when plans meet reality is one that I always want to keep in mind, is that no matter how well you structure a planning project or a study, the study will change, and that's okay. The real question is how do you adapt to the changing conditions, and how do you ensure that the project still is responsive to community needs and interest? So the big role there is certainly the TAC, being able to be open and honest with our TAC on these are the challenges we're encountering, or here are the opportunities we see. Here are some of the ways we can move forward, and here are the strengths and weaknesses with that. The big one, obviously, is how to handle tribal discussions in the pandemic environment in the way it's safe and respectful to tribal interests. And that's the big one to bring to the big discussion we had with the TAC is here are some of the ways we see you can do it. What makes sense? What makes sense to the TAC, and how can we respond to that? And that's why we actually they recommended extending the project. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's do that. Be considerate of what tools you do have and how you might complement those. You may have a lot of very quantitative people on your team, but quantitative analysts, but be thoughtful about what types of public involvement, especially in tribal communities, resources and consideration can you include, qualitative interviewing, that kind of aspect. Be thoughtful of what the project team's makeup is and how you can be how it can best serve the actual applied research approach. And the last one is how prepared or how baked you want your the research to be going into discussions with tribes and the TAC. Do you prepare really heavily, or do you just listen? And I think it's a little bit of balance of both. I think the most respectful approach to public involvement and research with tribes is really to err on the side of just listening. I think for me, one of the challenges I've encountered in my planning profession is I tend to prepare. I must know it. I must know everything going in. And for this type of research, that's a very uncompassionate approach to research. So instead, focusing much more on critical listening and responding like, this is what I'm hearing. Is that what you're saying, or does this fit your expectations? So trying to balance a mixture of doing your homework, but otherwise just listening and learning. And also with that is being sure that you are responding to the guidance from the TAC and other tribal planners, which has been, for the most part, just listen and learn. And so that's the approach that we've taken this as much as possible. 2 things to touch on before we close. One is we've been very clear about what our approach is and is not. And by no disrespect to academic researchers who may be on the line right now, one of the way we framed it is academic research approach is primarily for the production of knowledge generally. So a researcher has an idea about how the world works, tests an idea in a lab, validates the idea, publishes research, for their peers and so on in a journal. This is obviously an oversimplification, but that's one way to think about it. It's a common view from different communities. And so this is not our approach. Instead, we've emphasized that we have a very clear applied research approach, that our research, which is much more iterative and messy in a good way. So applied research is about addressing challenges and opportunities in a community. It's less about generating pure knowledge and more about addressing practical issues, although the two are not mutually exclusive. We focus on deliverables and tools, not necessarily publications. It's very iterative and non-linear. And most importantly, it starts, proceeds, and ends with the challenge or issue that the community identified in mind. And so the way I frame it up here is an applied research approach begins with the problem or opportunity in the community that's interested, in this case, in tribal planning community. The group determines how to learn more, which in our case was primarily through the TAC. Developed from there, gather information, develop the tools or new practice to serve the original need, and then and also reflect continuously on, is the problem or opportunity addressed? And if not, it's iterative. You move back so that you can move forward. That's a good thing. And we want to be able to emphasize that. So where are we going? Like I touched on the data collection, we're moving into the tribal discussions in the winter and spring, which will be heavily informed by meetings like this, as well as our interaction with the TAC, and then into tools development, more of the spring, summer time frame, towards report development at the end of summer and disseminating our findings in the summer and fall of 22. At a high level, those are the big milestones coming up. We have a lot of engagement throughout that. It's pretty simplified, but that's kind of the basic idea of where we're going from here. And so to close, I just want to thank you all for having me to go over this research. I want to thank my project team again for all the work that they have put in on this work, and the TAC for their involvement throughout in their upcoming meeting, which I think is on the 1st. But with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions, comments, or discussion that listeners may have.
Thank you, Cole. So those of you who are online, feel free to shoot your questions through the Q&A button. And I'll start off with a question of my own. So Cole, you mentioned that a lot of the existing planning tools or analysis tools don't align with tribal needs and contexts. Could you maybe describe, elaborate a little bit on what might be an example of that, and what are the needs and issues that need to be more dealt with using perhaps different tools?
Sure, and I touched on two of them. One is around safety, qualitative versus quantitative safety data. That's a pretty common one. Another one that I touched on as well is the safety as the aspect of jurisdiction, police jurisdiction and transportation planning. That's not something that often rises to the top in state or MPO planning, but as a very real challenge in tribal communities from what we're gathering. Some other ones are different types of modes that might be available. Think of Alaskan communities, for example, the issue of ice roads. That doesn't necessarily apply to the lower 48, but is a very real mode and transportation challenge that isn't as prominent in a lot of the planning analysis tools of how to develop and maintain ice roads. There was another one that just came to mind, and now I'm missing it. Thinking about, I lost it. There are others. They'll come to mind. But does that help a little bit?
So a question, as you work for FHWA, I assume that transportation planning in tribal communities almost always means roads and streets for cars. What happens if tribal communities don't necessarily want to have roads for cars?
Sure, I think that's one that came up with one of our TAC members in the Navajo community. She said that one of the biggest challenges that they encounter is that their plan in their system is designed for roads and designed to serve a certain purpose, which is around that. And it's very difficult to tell the story of what transportation can do outside of roads and streets, and what other modes are available, other acts, and how a transportation system can actually serve the community's interests, especially around, say, cultural resources and things like that, which may not be accessible by roads as well. And so our project is very much focused on more than just roads and bridges. It's instead, we're more focused on the process in tribes and what tools can be provided so that they can plan for the system that they actually want and need, rather than simply the one that exists, or the one that traditional road and highway planning presents.
All right, so I have a question from a student who says that they are unfamiliar with tribal transportation in general, much less how the US federal government funds and how everything interacts with tribes. They were wondering whether there were any examples of things that were planning or other things that didn't work well in the past that kind of spurred this particular research project and your work.
Yeah, and I think some of my project team would probably speak to a lot more about that. I think the big component is there's a wide variety of policy issues that we could dig into and research around that. And if you're a student at Portland State, I recommend a class that Shane Day teaches on Native American politics and policy, which is an excellent course that covers a lot of that deep history, more than I can probably cover here. But thinking more about the genesis of this project, it's a lot more of the feedback from tribal planners to the tribal transportation program, both at BIA and Federal Highway, of why do we have to develop these plans, and if we're going to develop them, it should be of some use to our community. And so if it's not, and so the question for the research team is, if it's not useful, if it's not providing use to planners, why is that? And if as well as what can we do to ensure that the tool that's available actually is of value and meets the needs for what tribes actually would like to see. And as a planner, I can speak to a lot of what a plan does and does not do, but the translation of that benefit to the community is really the meat of this research, is what we are learning about now. It's a little bit of a roundabout answer, but hopefully that starts you in the right direction.
A question from probably some fellow planners on the webinar. Did all tribes produce long-range transportation plans and tips?
All tribes that participate that receive TTP funding, yes. Misty, the project champion, is on. It should be listening as well, and so she might correct me on that. But I'm pretty confident if you receive TTP funding, then you do produce a long-range transportation plan and a tip.
So in one of your responses, you said that it's not just highways and roads. You said beyond roads. Can you give are you referring to multimodal options, or do you have other examples that you can maybe share with the audience?
Examples of what is currently being done in tribal communities, or examples of what our research hopes to achieve?
Both.
See, I'm not sure if I can off the top of my head. One of the big challenges is that a lot of tribal communities are in very rural areas, and if you think about transportation accessibility is access to destination is a function of a function of mobility and proximity to destination. So it's a transportation and land use together. So in more urban areas where you have higher proximity of destinations, mobility is less important, because you can have a lot of alternatives to where you need to go. So having high capacity, high mobility is less important. In rural areas tends to be the opposite. You have lower proximity to destinations, therefore you need a higher amount of mobility to reach an equivalent number of destinations. And so in tribal communities, just like other rural areas of the US, mobility tends to be more important. You need more mobility to get to the same level of component. So roads and highways tend to dominate, as they do in other rural areas as well. Now, what we have not encountered in this is what planning for active transportation, some of those other modes actually looks like yet. And I'm hoping that in our tribal discussions here in the winter and spring, we'll get some really good examples of that. So disappointing answer, but good reason to dig in winter and spring.
So I'm curious if you are exclusively working with federal and state recognized tribes, or also non-recognized tribal communities on this project?
Yeah, so without looking at the identified tribes yet, I suspect they are all federally recognized tribes that receive TTP funding at the moment. Now, outside of those we're doing specific discussions with around there, on that list and TTP funding, in the different engagement opportunities like National Transportation and Indian Country Conference, there's a much wider variety in there. So I think as of right now, our project list is more narrow, looking at federally recognized tribes that receive TTP funding.
All right, so there's a question from the audience that they said, in my mind, there are some fundamental differences between groups like FHWA and tribal communities in terms of organizational structure. For example, thinking about holistic, relational, earth-based ways of relating within Indigenous communities. They're curious how much reflection you've done around within the FHWA system or the FHWA team, and how it informs how you facilitate the current planning meetings that you're holding.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we certainly have. And that's I didn't get to dig too deep on that in this component, but that's a big question, especially with our TAC. And we have at least one tribal member on our project team as well, Misty Klon, and myself. But there's also the working with TAC of really discussing and working with them on what are the most appropriate approaches, what are the assumptions we need to disabuse ourselves of, and what's most respectful for public engagement with tribes and so on. And the big component, one of the things we've already talked about in our project team is being able to talk with elders in tribes specifically about, and that's a big component of why we want to be able to speak in person. It's probably the most respectful way to go about that, is to learn from tribal elders, especially about what does planning and public involvement and governance look like in your community, and how does say national federal regulations, how does that compare and differ from what actually is preferred in this community, and therefore how does that speak back to a better process going forward, a better tribal transportation program, one that's much more reflective and context sensitive to tribal interests.
Just one highlight in the comments, somebody noted that in New Mexico, some tribes plan and manage local trail systems which aren't open to motorized vehicles. So another question,
excellent.
If you, can you talk a little bit about the coordination with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Federal Highway Administration? This person says that they've seen when two federal agencies work together with the tribes, it can be challenging.
Sure, I can only speak so much to that. So I don't work directly with. I haven't worked directly with BIA in my current role too much, but we do within this study. We have the Bureau of Indian Affairs is also a part of the Technical Advisory Committee and part of our a lot of our federal discussions up to this point. Now, the two to give the quick overview is that tribes, as part of their tribal self-determination, is that they have a choice on what agency can choose to work with the BIA, or they can choose to work with the Federal Highway Administration. It's their choice and their preference on who they prefer to work with and who they would like to have, what their relationship has been and would like to be. And that's in our role as federal agencies to respect that. And so we're, I don't know, I guess as far as I would go on that, but the two agencies, and if you think about program management, I believe they actually have a joint program management guide for the TTV program that they do together. They have their own, they're highly collaborative in that regard. So it's truly is jointly managed on the program guidelines and so on.
All right, so a question about whether you've seen a growing demand for multimodal streets or facilities to encourage active transportation in tribal lands.
This is only going to be speaking anecdotally at this point. So again, I think we'll see a better response to that as we get into our tribal discussions. And in the limited number of interactions I've had, that hasn't risen to the top in terms of highest priorities. As I was thinking about non-street and highway projects, one that I completely forgot about is one I'm working on in Alaska right now, which is public easement to access the Copper River in Alaska. And in that regard, there's through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, there are easements, public easements across some tribal lands to access different, like the national parks and so on. It's been a running challenge is where these easements are, who can access them, and how they're developed and maintained. But that is generally a non-motorized or it's an off-road component primarily for hiking, for recreation, but also for subsistence access as well. So that's a bigger non-highway modal challenge and opportunity in that context as well.
Sorry, are the tribal long-range transportation plans posted online, or where could one view them?
So it depends. They're a sovereign nation, so it's their choice on whether they post them publicly or not, and whether they release them to, whether they allow the Federal Highway Administration to post them publicly. There are a few good examples out there that are available, and you generally would go tribe by tribe to look for that, because a lot of them do post them online. It's helpful information. But I think a good example of that challenge and opportunity is with tribal safety action plans. So the Federal Highway Administration funds safety plans and safety interventions in tribal communities nationally, and as part of that, an option tribes have is to post it publicly through this intertribal site called tribalsafety.org. And only so many choose to, and it's their choice on what they do or do not. But that's one resource you can take a look at. It shows here are some examples of safety plans that are made available publicly for dissemination. But to answer the core question, I think the answer is no. There isn't a consolidated, publicly available LRTP list.
All right, so I think one final question. There is an audience member that says that they recognize that there are differences between tribes, but do tribes generally place the same value on public outreach and stakeholder engagement in planning processes as FHWA, or do tribes prefer to defer to tribal leaders to determine the visions, goals, and identify projects of plans?
Yeah, I would avoid any kind of monolithic response to that, because it varies between tribal communities. And that's one of the things we've heard already is that in some cases there is a robust planning process, and that's more managed by tribal planners. In some cases, it's a higher deference to tribal elders and more of an informal process. And in some other cases, a lot of that is outsourced to consultants to lead that sort of process, and it's a bit more templated. So it really varies, but I think you're hitting on a key point that for us in our questions, in our conversations with both the TAC and tribal discussions is, what does that look like? How does it vary? And how does that inform the policies that the tribe ends up adopting through their plan and post decisions?
All right, thank you, Cole. I think that concludes our Friday seminar. So after the seminar ends, you'll have the opportunity to complete a brief survey. It takes a few minutes and we would appreciate your feedback. Thank you all for joining us today, and for students in the chat, Dr. Monsieur posted our post webinar Zoom event. So you can enter that if you like, and everyone have a great weekend. Thank you.
I'm also a student, so I'll be on there.